we can create a culture of peace with different values.
I've had an incredible life. I've met some of the most wonderful people that have changed the world, won gold medals, Oscars, Grammys, solved some big healthcare crises. But I've never sat with a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
I personally went into public service because I wanted to help people. And not only the Costa Rican people or the Central American peoples, the whole of humanity.
I've never sat with somebody that, as an individual, put a dent in the universe based on one simple premise, one purpose, one overriding passion to his life, and that is peace.
The Romans said, if you want to live in peace, prepare for war. That's quite stupid. If you want to live in peace, don't spend so much money on arms.
And that passion, I think he was born with. He certainly took in one of the most contested times in our history when Central America was ablaze with war and brought about the Arias Peace Plan.
I decided to tell the people what people need to know, not what they want to hear.
And even today, in his 80s, what he's trying to do is to build a peace museum, an oasis where we can go and realize that if humanity can come together and put down their arms and focus on education and healthcare, and focus on putting the human back in humanity, we'd be a much better world.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast, and ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated.
Oscar Arias, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Tony, thank you. I want to thank you for this opportunity.
You knew you were going to be a politician.
Yes, I knew that I was going to be a politician, and my dream was to become president one day.
So many kids dream, but how did you make that manifestation come real for you?
Well, I prepared for it. When I was in primary school, for every birthday, my father used to give me a biography of great men, from Lincoln and Napoleon to Churchill and FDR and De Gaulle. And I read so many biographies, Gladstone and Disraeli. This is why I decided to go and do my postgraduate work in the United Kingdom, because I fell in love with particularly Winston Churchill.
Yeah. And as you started to read these biographies, was there a common theme? Was there a certain DNA that someone that decides to serve their country, to seek the highest office?
Yes, different times, bringing about different people. Obviously, it's, I am a great admirer of the first emperor, Octavius Caesar Augustus, as well as Julius Caesar. He was murdered in 44 before Christ. And then Napoleon, this is the beginning of the 19th century. He became emperor. On the other side, you have the British prime ministers who are true Democrats, as well as Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson and Madison and John Adams. So it's quite a mixture of great people who became involved in politics, always fighting for their ideals.
Costa Rica was a country that said no to the military in the 40s. When you take over as president, surrounding your country, there's a lot of war going on. Paint a picture of what was going on, what you had to deal with in terms of your neighboring countries, and more importantly, Gorbachev and Reagan maybe treating this as a little chessboard where they could play with their military.
Well, I happened to be elected in 1986. In 1986, the whole of Central America was involved in a very bloody conflict. The two superpowers were fighting a proxy war. I used to say at the time, the Soviet Union and the US provide the arms, and we, Central Americans, provide the debt. There were conflicts in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and particularly in Nicaragua. The U.S. government was obsessed with getting rid of Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, of the Sandinistas, through military means. I had campaigned for more than a year promising a negotiated solution to the conflicts in the three countries, using diplomacy, trying to bring the different parties to the negotiating table. The Americans knew about my promises or pledges to the Costa Rican people, and they didn't like my candidacy. So they supported my opponent. A few years after I had stepped down from office, I had the chance of meeting Roger Ailes. He had been advising my opponent, paid by the Republicans. And I asked him, what did you tell my opponents? And he said to me, laughing, you just have to break Oscar Arias' knees. So that was a tough campaign. I won it. For my inauguration, President Reagan sent Vice President Bush, and I said to Vice President Bush, you know that we are very close friends, Costa Rica and the U.S. Most Costa Ricans admire the U.S., but sometimes friends have agreements and sometimes disagreements. I need to tell you, Mr. Vice President, concerning your policy towards Central America, I strongly disagree with your government. So they knew since the very beginning that I was not going to support the Reagan administration looking for military solutions to the conflicts.
To stand up to the United States, what gave you the courage to say to them that when it comes to my country, you're not going to have your military here, you're not going to have your rebels within my boundaries?
From my value system, from my principles, I couldn't lie to the Costa Rican people. I had promised I was going to look for a negotiated peace. In my political career of more than 50 years, I decided to tell the people what people need to know, not what they want to hear. You could become a politician lying to people, telling them what people want to hear, but that's the denial of real leadership. So I tried to be very honest, intellectually and morally also, for sure.
So you talk about these skirmishes and wars that are happening, how military seemed to be the blinders that the Americans had on. Talk to me about how you started to build not only support within Costa Rica, but within Europe.
I was inaugurated in May of 1986. In December of that same year, I was invited for the first time to the White House. I never expected that I was so important to visit President Reagan. In my first visit to the Oval Office, I realized how committed he was to a military solution, particularly here in Nicaragua, our neighbor to the north. All my pledges to the Costa Rican people, I wasn't able to fulfill any of them if the Contras, the Contra rebels, as they were called at the time, were using our territory in order to fight the Sandinistas. So I expelled all the comandantes. I expelled everybody from our territory. And that obviously annoyed the U.S. government. I found out eventually that AID had hired many houses to keep the arms for the Contras, the medications for the wounded. And I realized, we have been taken by the Americans. Vice President Bush invited me for a gin and tonic at his house. We had a couple of drinks. I came back from Washington, committed to draft a peace plan. A peace plan because we had nothing on the table but war. This is the Arias Peace Plan. I invited the president of Guatemala, Vinicius Cerezo, the president of Salvador, Napoleon Duarte, and from Honduras, President Ascona, to come here to San Jose. That was February of 1987. Eventually, I visited Daniel Ortega in Managua to talk about my peace initiative. I decided to go to Europe, to go to the rest of the Latin American countries in order to get their support. I got all the support from the whole of Latin America, but Europe was much more important. I remember visiting Portugal, Mario Suarez, Spain with Felipe González, Helmut Kohl in Germany, François Mitterrand in France, Pope John Paul in the Vatican, and many others. At the end, I visited the UK. The Queen invited me to have lunch at Buckingham Palace with the Vice Chancellor of the University of Essex and some of my professors, where I got a PhD. And she asked me, "What's the purpose of your trip?" And I said to her, "I have launched a peace plan because in Central America there is an awful war that we are killing each other, and I want to pacify the region through diplomacy." But unfortunately, Her Majesty, Margaret Thatcher is very busy because she is campaigning. She has an election in 2 weeks, and I'm going to see her deputy prime minister. The next day, I got a phone call from the Foreign Office, and I was told, "Mrs. Thatcher wants to see you at 11 o'clock at 10 Downing Street." So it was really interesting. She took some time from her campaign. We met for an hour and a half. We had a long discussion. And her main argument was, for a real peace, democracy is a precondition. We have democracy, free elections, if we want to have real peace in the region. That implied that for the Sandinistas, they needed to hold an election. I do remember Fidel Castro telling Daniel Ortega all the time and telling me, "Don't ask for an election in Nicaragua. Revolutionaries don't hold elections." And he used to tell Daniel Ortega in front of me, "Don't fall into Arias' trap." Anyway, Mrs. Thatcher was very skeptical about a communist government in Nicaragua holding elections. Not only her, but all the members of the Reagan administration used to tell me, "You are so naive." I had no answer for that question because all I could tell them is, well, there is always a first time. Let's wait and see. But I need to tell you that if he signs the peace plan, the international pressure is going to be so strong that he has to hold free elections. And that's exactly what happened. He held those elections and he lost the elections. And Violeta Chamorro won the elections and became the next president of Nicaragua.
How was the transfer of power? Because I have to believe when you have Fidel Castro whispering in your ear, when you're a revolutionary, it's quite a defeat. It's much bigger than a defeat in a democratic country. So how was the transfer of power? Were you ever worried at a time he wasn't going to abandon the power and just say the election was fake or was rigged and I'm staying in power?
At 1 o'clock in the morning, I was talking to Tomás Borge, one of the commandantes, the Marxist, and I told him, "You must transfer power. You have lost the election." And President Carter, the next day, went to see Daniel Ortega and told him the same. The inauguration was held in the baseball stadium. It was full of people from everywhere. It was a very nice ceremony. I thanked Violeta Chamorro because she said a few words about me, thanking me for being the author of the peace plan. I almost cried because I felt very moved.
You have to feel moved. I mean, you're dealing in a foreign country. It's a stadium full of people, and they're cheering their freedom.
Then we had to wait and see if there was the will in the Central American governments to comply with what we had agreed. Bernie Aronson, as well as the deputy foreign minister from the Soviet Union, were very supportive. And eventually, we silenced the guns in the region.
What was the role of Gorbachev during this time? Because the history sees Gorbachev and the Berlin Wall coming down. But how was your relationship with Gorbachev compared to your relationship with the American presidents?
I never met Gorbachev while I was president. We became very good friends later on because he always invited me to a conference that he used to hold in San Francisco. It was called the State of the World Forum. So we had a chance to talk about many things. One of those things was not 1 inch. NATO won't be expanded not 1 inch to the east. One of the big lies from the U.S. governments, because NATO was expanded until today.
Let's go back to the Arias Peace Plan. How did the Nobel Peace Prize come about? From what I understand in reading the history of Costa Rica, it was one of the proudest moments of this country. Were you surprised?
Well, I do remember in June of 1987, I was staying with my wife and some ministers of my cabinet at the Charles Hotel in Cambridge. I had been invited by the Kennedy School to address the students. Suddenly in the lobby, there were like 100 students from Latin American countries, from different universities. Harvard, MIT, Brandeis, BU, BC, Tufts, and you name it. And they were telling me, this is June of 1987. We would like to nominate you for the Nobel Peace Prize. So I said to them, well, that's quite an honor. But let us remember that the last day in order to nominate is the end of January. So you can nominate me, but this will be for 1988. So then when I was called at 4 o'clock in the morning, get up, you have been honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. Later on, I found out that I had been nominated by 3 Swedes whom I didn't know. And they simply read about my confrontation with the 2 superpowers and nominated me.
Must have been a very proud moment for you. Everything that happened, the stadium, Nicaragua, getting the Nobel Peace Prize, if you were leaving this planet tomorrow, what would you say would stand out the most for you? Would it be the Nobel Peace Prize, or would it be the fact that you freed the Nicaraguans of a communist regime? Would it be just the fact that you honored your principles to Costa Rica? Is there one thing that stands out?
In my second term as president of this country, from 2006 to 2010, the General Assembly of the UN approved the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty was born at the Arias Foundation for Peace in the mid-90s. And while I was a private citizen making speeches in universities all around the world, making speeches and receiving honorary degrees, particularly from the U.S., as a matter of fact, I have 93 honorary degrees and 85 of them are from U.S. universities and colleges. I was always mentioning there is a need to put an end to the trade of weapons in the world, the so-called Arms Trade Treaty. And in 2013, it was approved by the General Assembly and came into effect in 2014 in Geneva. I think that is the greatest contribution of Costa Rican diplomacy to humanity.
We're going to get to the Peace Museum, but the thing that hurts you the most is the trillions of dollars every year we just spend on weaponry and weapons of mass destruction. Tell me a little bit about that economic engine and how it could be repurposed for a better planet.
It's very simple, but it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult because with the value system that prevails today in our societies, it is not possible to spend scarce resources in satisfying the basic needs of people. For one simple reason, the leadership of the U.S. is so strong, and the U.S. has been a people of warriors, and you believe in a strong military. You were born fighting the English in 1776, in 1812. In 1823, you drafted the Monroe Doctrine. In 1846, you invaded Mexico. In 1898, you fought the Spaniards and got Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Then you got involved for good in the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Syria. Now you bomb Iran. You've been involved in so many conflicts because you want to be the most powerful military power on earth. The Chinese spend less than 1/3 of what the Pentagon is spending. You are spending $1 trillion, and the world is spending $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion is like 12 times more of what the world is spending in official development assistance. That is foreign aid. And only recently you have shut down USAID. In other words, you prefer to spend building tanks and fighter jets and nuclear submarines than feed the people in Africa, in Asia, in poor countries. The Romans said, if you want to live in peace, prepare for war. That's quite stupid. If you want to live in peace, don't spend so much money on arms and soldiers. Now, it's not easy to contradict the U.S. government. Only recently, President Trump succeeded in forcing the rest of the NATO members to spend 5% of GDP in the next 5 years. That is the most wasteful way of spending your scarce resources, because official development assistance is going to be used in order to spend more on arms and sophisticated weapons than on people. And as you know, poverty needs no passport to travel. If immigration is one of the big issues, today it is going to be worse when you cannot feed the hungry in Africa or in Asian countries or even in Haiti here in this hemisphere. But you know, as Henry Kissinger once said, it is difficult to be an enemy of the U.S., but to be a friend is fatal. It's not easy to persuade American governments that to spend on arms and soldiers is the waste of money. These are the wrong priorities for a more peaceful world in the future. And these are the wrong priorities simply because the values are wrong. And if the values are wrong, then the priorities of governments are wrong.
Do you think there's a young Oscar Arias out that can emerge in this world and bring together the superpowers the way you brought together the presidents in Central America, lock them in a room, get them to realize spending on military can't lead to anything positive? Do you think that's a possibility, or are they just so obsessed with who's got the biggest stick wins that we'll never get any of them to even consider repurposing that money for what the average person in their hearts and their minds, what every mother would want, is to have a world where their sons and daughters didn't go to fight? Or have we gone so far in the civilization that all the negotiation and diplomacy that you showed in 1986 can't exist in 2024, 2025, 2026?
As Jesus said, it is more important to give than to receive. I personally went into public service because I wanted to help people. And not only the Costa Rican people or the Central American peoples, the whole of humanity. Where do you get the money to spend more on potable water, on infrastructure, on electricity, on healthcare, education, on culture? From where? Governments are not willing to increase taxes. The U.S. is always cutting taxes to the wealthy. The only way is to cut or to freeze military spending. Why do you need $1 trillion? And why do you need more nuclear submarines and more fighter jets and more atomic bombs? It's the waste of money. I do remember President Reagan, who said something like, we declare war on poverty and poverty won. Now, when I see President Trump trying to remove the poor people in Washington, D.C., he doesn't want to improve the living standards of poor people in the U.S. or in the world. He wants to hide the poor people. And the only way, for instance, to stop immigration is if those poor people can stay in their own countries. But the people of sub-Saharan Africa are prepared to risk their lives, through the Mediterranean in order to go to European countries, as the Latin American countries. And here, through Panama, you find Pakistanis, Indians, Africans, people from Cambodia, from Vietnam, from everywhere, trying to walk all the way to the Mexican border with the U.S. Instead of building walls, we could spend more on the poor people of the world.
Do you think democracy can continue to succeed? Because when I look at democracy right now, I'm seeing leaders ignoring Congress. They're suspending Parliament. They're making decisions that are, the conspiracists would say, are much more global.
Democracy can continue if it delivers the goods. If you can improve through democracy and democratic institutions and enjoying freedom, if you can improve the living conditions of people. But if democracy doesn't deliver the goods, then what you will have is a lot of autocrats. Now in Europe, the predominant parties in government are right-wing parties. And the main concern is immigration. I do think that they are right. They should be concerned about immigration, particularly Muslims, because it's not easy to assimilate such a different culture and religion as Islam.
But your answer is if those countries could find a standard of living, they wouldn't have to leave. They'd be very happy where they are.
Yeah, for sure.
When we return, Oscar and I talk about a speech that was heard around the world, and then he'll explain his thinking behind the Peace Museum and why it's not just for Costa Rica, but for humanity. Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC. $500 billion in sustainable financing to combat climate change. $500 million for Future Launch, a 10-year program to prepare youth for the jobs of tomorrow. Helping to discover the next generation of Olympians, artists monetizing their talents, women entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams, supporting mental health, and so much more. Investing in Canada, well, that matters to RBC.
With the smallest percentages changes, we could equip all homes with electricity, achieve universal literacy, and eradicate all preventable diseases. These are the dividends of peace. That is what we could gain if we put an end to our Russian roulette of military spending.
Joining me today, a Nobel Peace Prize Laureate, Oscar Arias, who also holds the honor of being Costa Rican's president on 2 separate occasions.
Oscar, you made one of the most important speeches in 2008. Maybe you could share with us what you said and how those words roared around the world.
This was in 2008. I addressed the Security Council with the presidents attending that meeting, the presidents of the 5 permanent members. President Obama from the US, President Sarkozy from France, Prime Minister Gordon Brown from the UK, Medvedev from Russia, and Hu Jintao from China. And I said to them, in the year 1945, when the smoke of the worst war ever fought by humanity was still clearing, the founders of this organization wrote in Article 26 of the UN Charter, quote, in order to promote the establishment and maintenance of international peace and security with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources, the Security Council shall be responsible for formulating, with the assistance of the Military Staff Committee referred to in Article 47, plans to be submitted to the members of the United Nations for the establishment of a system for the regulation of armaments. End of quote. The wording of this article is not innocent. It makes a judgment that must be understood by this council. The spending in armaments is a diversion of human and economic resources, meaning a destination that is different to the proper use of such resources. And then I want to remind you what a great president of the U.S. once said. These are the words of President Eisenhower. Every gun that is made, every warship launch, every rocket fire signifies, in the final sense, a death from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This war in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children.
Talk to me about your dream of having a museum dedicated to peace and why you want to have it in Costa Rica. Because as you said, the diplomacy that came from this country is something that every Costa Rican should be very proud of.
No other country in the world, Tony, has the moral authority to build a peace museum as we do. We abolished the army in 1948, and by doing that, we declare peace to the world. In my first term in office, I held a hemispheric summit here. President Bush attended. I invited all the presidents and prime ministers except dictators. I didn't invite Pinochet or Fidel Castro. Only a few weeks later, the U.S. invaded Panama City. It dropped bombs in Panama City in order to kidnap Noriega. And they swore in Guillermo Andara as the new president of Panama. Because he was sworn in the U.S. Canal Zone, no Latin American country wanted to recognize him as the new president. And since I was about to finish my term, I said to him, since we are neighbors, I would like to recognize you as president and establish diplomatic relations with your government under one condition. If we get rid of the Panamanian army, that's Costa Rican imperialism. And he agreed. We got rid of the Panamanian army by amending the Constitution, and eventually, a few years later, with President Aristide, we also got rid of the Haitian army. Then I went to Sub-Saharan Africa and spent 4 months. I lived in Tanzania, in Arusha. I held many conferences with prime ministers, with presidents, with defense ministers, in order to freeze military spending or, if possible, get rid of an army. I failed. I wasn't able to persuade anybody. But since the most perverse way of spending scarce resources is in arms and soldiers, so we have the moral authority to tell the world we can create a culture of peace with different values. We should highlight those conflicts that have been solved at the negotiating table, like Northern Ireland, like Camp David, like Arafat meeting with Rabin and Shimon Peres in Norway, and winning the Nobel Peace Prize for 1993, when they decided, well, the only way to solve this conflict is if we believe in the two-state solution. I believe that the use of military force should be the last resort. And in this museum, we would like to show what philosophers in the last 2,500 years have said and written about peace. And most importantly, I would like to highlight the so-called peace dividends. What it means to spend your resources building roads, hospitals, universities, schools, educating nurses, doctors instead of soldiers. Only Costa Rica has the moral authority to tell the world this kind of spending is really immoral.
So you've got a world-renowned architect, a Costa Rican, Benjamin Sachs. You're working with a variety of different people. What is it going to take to have this museum built? How do you hope it celebrates and fosters peace going forward?
I bought a piece of land in front of the Democracy Square, a Democracy Square that I built in my first government. In front of the Democracy Square is the National Museum. Here is the Jade Museum. And here is the piece of land that I bought. So around this Democracy Square, there will be 3 museums. I am using all the money of the Arias Foundation endowment, but we still a little bit more in order to build it and to pay for the museography.
There's always a game you play at dinner parties. If you could have anybody at your dinner table, pick 6 guests, alive or past, who would be the 6 people you would invite to dinner?
The most brilliant statesman that I got to know in 50 years in politics is Helmut Schmidt. Then I would have loved to sit with Winston Churchill, with Charles de Gaulle, Willy Brandt, with Martin Luther King, and with the wisest of all, perhaps the bravest, Abraham Lincoln.
You know, I always end my interviews with my 3 takeaways. The first one is tell the people what they need to know, not what they want to hear. I think it's the most powerful piece of advice. It's a piece of advice I think parents should have with their children, I think leaders should have with their business, and leaders should have with their citizens, is the fact that we focus on what they need to know versus what they want to hear. The second one, interesting enough, was the only time you actually cited religion was Jesus. It's better to give than receive. That's 5, 6 words. But if we approach that as humanity and we put it out in the world, we just gave versus receiving, I think the world would be so much different. And it's the simplest way to crystallize your values. But I think the third thing and the most important thing that is that kid that grew up waiting for their birthdays to read an autobiography and read about all these wonderful people that you just quote. There'll be a book written about Oscar Arias and his peace plan and this kid from Costa Rica that not only brought peace to Central America, but had the General Assembly vote on something that began in your foundation. So I've been sitting with an individual who talks about Martin Luther King and Caesar and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Schmidt and as people he admired, but I realize he belongs at that table. He belongs in the same conversation.
Tony, thank you. I want to thank you for this opportunity. The purpose of political leadership is to educate. And that's why you need to tell people what they need to know, not what they want to hear.
Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chatter That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.